This is the K-State Radio Network, and welcome once more to Agriculture Today. What with our winter wheat crop in Kansas not exactly up to snuff as far as its yield potential, there are considerations out there on the part of producers as to salvaging that wheat as a forage crop for beef cattle, and that's a viable alternative given that it's managed correctly. And toward that latter end, we offer some thoughts on using wheat as a hay or a silage crop. Justin Waggoner is with us once again, Beef Systems Specialist, K-State Research and Extension. He just contributed to an article on the topic as well in the Agronomy E-Update newsletter this past Friday. So what are you hearing and seeing out there in the country? You're based in southwest Kansas, Justin, as far as the interest in utilizing wheat in this fashion.
Well, I think first and foremost, Eric, there seems to be a very strong demand for forages, and just due to the dry conditions that have been across a good chunk of southwest Kansas and even some other parts of the state. In terms of the wheat crop, I think there, depending on the situation and location, there is some interest in maybe some potential other options for that wheat, especially if the yield potential has maybe been diminished or doesn't look to be as maybe exciting as we move forward or get closer to harvest here.
When you think about the feeding programs that a wheat hay or a wheat silage might suit, actually a number of cattle production programs could use this kind of forage, you say?
That's correct, Eric. I mean, if we look at just typical nutrient composition values of wheat hay, and there can be quite a bit of variation in this, but, typically wheat hay and silage on a dry matter basis is going to be in the range of 50 to 60% TDN. Our crude protein content can really range from the 15 to 16% protein level and go on down into the 7 or 8 range. Now, that depends heavily on the stage of maturity. Obviously, as that wheat and the maturity advances, that protein content goes down the stalk as we begin to get closer to grain harvest. So there's a little bit more variation there, but without a doubt, as we look at that potential of that crop as a forage for cattle, the wheat hay or silage, could potentially fit a number of different cattle operations, ranging from cows that are maybe being fed to stocker and growing operations, even all the way to the feedlot sector could certainly use those feedstuffs as well.
But to get the most out of those feedstuffs, one has to manage the harvest accordingly. And let's talk about the silage. Moisture level is always a major component when it comes to putting up any kind of forage as silage, and the wheat is no exception here, Justin.
That's correct. We want to make sure that wheat that we've got the proper moisture level. So our optimum moisture level on this wheat, is if we're looking at taking it to a silage endpoint, would be in the upper to mid-60s in terms of the moisture content if we're going to put that in the silo. So our optimum stage on the crop would be the soft dough stage. We're typically looking at that before we get a more advanced head production.
The question always comes up, though, when ensiling a crop like this, do you aim for quality, or do you aim for tonnage, or do you try to strike a balance between the two?
Well, I think that's always the debate with a forage crop. And, one of the challenges I think we have this year in some situations is we know the tonnage may be a bit of a limiting factor just due to drought conditions. So really, I think, it's really always a good idea to try to put up the best quality feed that we can, and as much of that feed as we can, even though we may take a little bit of a decline in terms of the nutrient composition of that forage once we get it put up.
And is there some sort of ballpark expectation on level of tonnage one could normally expect from ensiled wheat then?
In terms of the tonnage, I'm not sure, what normal would necessarily be. Mm-hmm. I think the bigger question is there enough standing biomass out there to justify, harvesting this crop as silage? We're putting this out there as an option. I think it's always, really just a good check to say, okay, how much actual feed is really going to be here, and what's really going to be my cost once I get it into the bunker and obviously delivered to the cattle.
And one needs to put a pencil to all of those factors, of course. What about wheat hay then? And producers have possibly had more experience with that out there. It's a good forage alternative for wheat that's not going to grain. What do producers need to think about in those terms?
Well, I think there's some advantages as we look at hay versus silage. One, hay is obviously more portable, and so that can be a big advantage, especially if they're looking at potentially selling this crop. There's a couple of other some degree of concerns in terms of the tonnage that's out there, just like there would be with silage. The other issue that we often see with wheat hay would be the presence of the awns. That's also something to kind of keep them back. So once again, harvesting that before we see full development there, I think is something to consider as well. If those awns are going to be a problematic as we get closer to harvest or so forth, or make that decision a little bit later, we probably need to be looking at grinding that hay, and then even after that, monitoring cattle for presence of problems that could be developed later on. Another issue that I think we certainly have to address on the livestock side is wheat is a nitrate accumulator,
right.
And so depending on a variety of conditions, fertilization history, et cetera, with drought conditions, we could see some high nitrate levels in some of the wheat. So I always kind of recommend that it might be a good idea to test that wheat prior to taking it as a hay crop. If we decide that we're going to hay it, but we don't either have time or decide not to, or we've purchased wheat hay, always be a good idea to run that nitrate analysis ad hoc. In addition to that, if we do sample it and the nitrates are high, that may make the silage option more attractive. Typically, when we have high levels of nitrates in a feedstuff or a forage and we put it through the ensiling process, we can reduce our nitrate levels by, a lot of people say 50%. My number is really 30 to 70%. We see a reduction. That reduction really varies quite a bit. But it still can be a good option if we know the nitrate levels are high coming into it.
And speaking basically, when putting up wheat as hay, what's the prime stage of growth for that? Is there a little more latitude here as opposed to silage then?
Well, there's typically, if we look at wheat that's harvested in the boot stage, we've got a higher quality. We've got somewhat less concern relative to the awns. However, if we go to kind of the early milk stage, that's probably where we see that intersection between, maximizing our forage yield as well as the quality of that forage is out there. And so, once again, I think the challenge with a small cereal like wheat is that it can, depending on weather conditions, we can go through those stages relatively rapidly, right? So that's always something to keep in mind there, that we can move through those stages relatively quickly depending on the fields and where they're located at within the state.
So these are practical alternatives for a wheat crop that won't be up to standards as far as grain yield, but could surely be salvaged and utilized as forage for cattle. And even if one isn't running cattle, is strictly a wheat producer or a grain producer, the market is such now that there's value in this crop as a forage.
That's right, Eric. I think there's, as we discussed earlier, there seems to be very strong demand for forages that are available to us due to dry conditions. The other side of this is, I think we also have to be aware, if this wheat crop has been insured. And so if they do want to look at these options as a producer taking it as hay, I really would recommend, they get with their crop insurance personnel, check with them. We all know that there's stipulations associated with those things in terms of checks and what have to be done. And so maybe working in front of that, if we make that decision, and with all that aside, we're probably getting very close to needing to make some of these decisions on this wheat very shortly.
No question, for a number of reasons. By all means, do make that contact initially with your crop insurance personnel to assure that whatever you do to salvage that wheat as a forage is within the guidelines of that coverage. And there is an article that is even greater in detail on utilizing wheat as silage or as hay in that Agronomy e-update newsletter at agronomy.ksu.edu. It was posted this past Friday. And we appreciate the look at this from the vantage point of how that hay or silage can be put up for maximum utility to the cattle herd. Justin, and we'll talk again later. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric.
He's a beef systems specialist, K-State Research and Extension, based in southwest Kansas. That's Justin Waggoner. You're listening to Agriculture Today. After this break, we'll be back with another informational exchange featuring K-State researchers who are part of the Beef Cattle Institute here at the university. They've offered up their latest podcast, and we'll listen in on that in a few moments here on the K-State Radio Network.
Agriculture and food systems are the main drivers of the Kansas economy, but must be improved in order to feed the world's growing population. How are we going to do so? Reduce food loss, find ways to preserve grasslands, and help families stretch their dollars. Global food systems is one of the 5 grand challenges K-State Research and Extension is addressing. To learn more, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
Now for you on Agriculture Today, a portion of this week's podcast from the Beef Cattle Institute here at Kansas State University. As we introduced this series last week, we mentioned that the research team at the Institute gathers regularly for this BCI Cattle Chat, as they call it, discussing current topics in cattle production and health management. This week, they tackle a trio of topics, do cow-calf specialist Bob Weber, livestock economist Dustin Pendle, and leading it off, the director of the BCI, K-State veterinarian Brad White.
On today's episode, we're going to talk about indexes and EPDs and how we pick the right bulls. We'll touch on sustainability and the U.S. Roundtable, as well as pre-weaning BRD. But I'd like to start out today and thinking about, and we talked some last week about buying bulls. What we didn't talk about was how do we pick which bulls we want to buy? Dr. Weber, that's right.
Yeah,
in
so
your
that's
area.
a great question, Brad, and that's where selection indexes come in play. They're a single value that describes differences in expected profit for progeny of certain bulls, and it's reported in dollars, so it's pretty, Dr. Pendle, pretty easy for people to understand dollars, right? They get that. And it boils the selection criteria down to the ones that have economic impact to a specific marketing endpoint. Rather than try and sort through the 12 or 13 EPDs, the index points you to the bulls that have economic value to some endpoint. So the key thing when you're using it in this context is pick the right index, right? So don't use a terminal index to build replacement females, for example, because the economic weightings on the maternal traits are big whopping zeros, and then you face all the antagonisms of, say, increased cow size and the like if you use a terminal index for building replacement heifers. So key thing is align the index with your marketing endpoint and your production scenario to sort that out, and then you can really use it to drive your selection in a positive direction across a lot of traits, but using one value in our selection criteria.
So if I pick one index, which is counter to everything we've said for the last 20 years,
right,
is don't single trait select.
Right.
But you're not, because in that index, it accounts for several things, not just a single trait.
Right. So it puts the right amount of selection emphasis based on the economic value of a trait and the amount of genetic variation in the trait, so that you don't have to seat of the pants to decide, well, I need to really select for calving ease and weaning weight and a little bit of carcass merit. It sorts that out relative to the scenario that it describes.
But I need to have a plan. Terminal, maternal.
Yes, absolutely. So you can get as far off track using the wrong selection index as you can using the wrong EPDs in the selection criteria.
What about some of the other data in the sale catalog? Can I ignore it? Is there anything else I need to look at?
That's great. I noticed you did something there. At first you said there's lots of information in the sale catalog and all these different kinds of information. Those are actually data points, right? So not everything in the sale catalog is actually useful to a particular producer or a particular scenario. So being able to sort of distill that down to the essence of the things that are important is really key in making the right decision. And going straight to indexes to build your short list of bulls for a bull sale really helps get you pointed the right way.
And that saves a lot of time because those catalogs take a long time to go through. And
right.
I feel bad looking at all the data there and not taking it into account in my decision. Now I feel better.
Yeah, don't worry if the actual performance data in there is useful just to know sort of something about the production environment they were reared in, but tells us in the grand scheme of things not very much about genetic potential, right? The EPDs and indexes have taken those environmental things out and sort of purified the data. So yeah, skew your selection to a few EPDs that are important, or go to a selection index as the criteria to drive your selections. It'll simplify your life.
Yeah,
a lot, and nobody's sad about that, right?
And exactly, that's what we want, and that's as we think about things that have come out. One of the places I was last week, I was at the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and the Beef Cattle Institute has been a member of that group from the start, and it is an interesting group in that we get to interact with people throughout the beef value chain. So everybody from cow-calf producers to stockers to livestock markets to feed yards to packers, and even to retailers and quick service restaurants that deal directly with consumers. The focus of that roundtable has been getting all those people in the same room, which has led to some very interesting conversations.
I suspect.
which is really good as we move forward. One of the things that came out last week, and this is an area where you can also comment on, the USRSB, the roundtable, came out with a framework or guidelines, and really there are high priority indicators or key metrics that have been listed, and these areas are in animal health and well-being, efficiency and yield, employee safety and well-being, land resources, water resources, air and greenhouse gas emissions. So those 6 categories are areas that are guidelines that we want to look at when we evaluate sustainability. Because one of the questions has been, sustainability is a broad word, what does it mean? In this context, we're thinking in those 6 different areas. That framework for how you evaluate those 6 areas in each segment of the industry is what has come out for comment. So this is not a guideline, this is not something that you must do, but it allows an area for how could we evaluate that and really look toward the goal of continuous improvement.
And so if somebody's wanting to make some comments, where do they go?
So if you want to make comments, you go to the usrsbframework.org, the website, and you can log on. You have to have a login just so that they can allow to track the comments, and the comments are going to be open the next 60 days, I think, till July 1, and then you will be able to put your comments in, and then the USRSB will respond to those comments.
And so for each segment, there's these 6 different areas, correct? Yep. And so then they can go and read about all these different metrics to make the various comments.
Yep. For example, on the animal health aspects in the cow-calf, a lot of those go back to beef quality assurance guidelines and how do we manage animal health and go through that aspect. So there are different areas. Each of those has been created by a working group that was in that area, and then it's received feedback from the entire USRSB. And I tell you, it's a great experience being able to have some of those conversations in a pretty open forum. The other thing is as we go into summer, and I wanted to share a little bit, and we've worked on a project the last several years, a collaborative project between Kansas State, University of Georgia, North Dakota, several other areas in Mississippi State that has looked at pre-weaning BRD in calves. And so this would be defined as when the calves get pre-weaning BRD, typically spring calving herd, typically it's late summer. But I thought it was interesting because one of our collaborative articles came out the other day, and we did a case control study. So this means we looked at herds that had the problem and herds that didn't have the problem and tried to identify some differences. A couple things came from that study. One of the reasons we did it, we don't know all the causes for pre-weaning BRD. It's a little bit different than the BRD respiratory disease that we see in the feed yard. One of the things that we found when we looked at that article was the greater the herd size, the more likely it was to have pre-weaning BRD, which makes sense. So a single case of pre-weaning BRD, more likely if we've got more cows. But a couple other interesting things were if the herd used intensive grazing, they were about 3 times more likely to have pre-weaning BRD. And if they used an estrus synchronization program, they were about 4.5 times more likely to have pre-weaning BRD. What do you guys make of that?
Yeah, so there was I think maybe one of your colleagues from Mississippi State presented at the BIF meetings last year, and or the Applied Repro Conference here in Manhattan, and talked about that in herds that we think have these elevated levels of management. So they do things like management or intensive grazing systems, ester synchronization protocols, where they get commingling of calf groups potentially, or new novel nose-to-nose exposures. And I thought that was really interesting that, sometimes the stuff we think we're doing from a management perspective that has benefits, obviously, but one of the things we haven't thought through is maybe the animal disease and biosecurity stuff of even animals we own in our system being novel to each other. That's really interesting. Yeah.
Well, and the close contact. And so if we're dealing with contagious pathogens, close contact is one of the issues. And some of those ester synchronization programs, when we do it and we manage the cows, what do we do with the calves? We put them in pretty close contact so that we can run the cows through and do the sync program.
Yeah.
I would want to emphasize, I think both of those are good practices. Intensive grazing and ester synchronization. But if we've got pre-weaning BRD, we may want to look at how we implement those practices. Most farms don't have a problem with pre-weaning BRD. The farms that have a problem with pre-weaning BRD, it seems to be a recurring problem year after year. And so that's where we're trying to evaluate what are some of the things that are different between those farms. So we've enjoyed having you spend some time with us today. And next week, Dr. Pendell will be talking some about the costs for BRD and how we could change what would happen if we could do some better prevention. How would we get some of that value back, or how much can we spend on that? And we'll also be addressing some other issues that come up in the beef industry. So shoot us your questions, shoot us your comments. We're happy to take the feedback. We're available at bci@ksu.edu. Our website is www.beefcattleinstitute.org, or you can contact us on Twitter at @the_BCI.
K-State's Brad White, Bob Weber, and Dustin Pendell with this week's BCI Cattle Chat podcast. Hear the entire conversation again at beefcattleinstitute.org. This is Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen. This is our state, Kansas.
I see him as the Kansan, representing all our wheat farmers and our standing as a wheat-producing state.
That's Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
Recently, the Manhattan Mercury, the local paper, has spent quite a few lines with photos on Johnny Caw. Johnny, or Farmer Caw, is a 24 feet tall plush statue standing at the corner at downtown City Park. He has been standing there for something like 52 years, gazing at the traffic flowing by, as well as the pedestrians strolling in front of him. Recently, there was a birthday party held in his honor. He is 52 years young. Not a bad age for a farmer. Remember, he's a big man, 25 feet or so tall. He stands there looking out with his hands resting on his sides. It's a big sight, befitting a big man. I don't remember how many acres of Kansas wheat he could lay down with one mighty sweep, but it is impressive. I see him as the Kansan representing all our wheat farmers and our standing as a wheat-producing state. Recently, a birthday party was organized around this Kansas wheat grower. The aim was to have some fun and to raise money to improve and maintain the site where he stands. I expect that Johnny himself needs some attention as well. Standing in all kinds of Kansas weather does wear you out. A touch-up paint job, trimming his long blonde hair, cutting his fingernails won't hurt. Polishing his belt buckle might be a good idea. And of course, there is the scythe. It will need some sharpening before harvest time. The strong hickory handle is still good, but a good sharpening of the blades won't hurt. But as he stands, there's no question he is a great wheat grower, doing a very good job representing our wheat state. Reading up on him, I read that other feats were attributed to him. I don't think he invented the sunflower, even though the article states he did. I like to think of the Kansas sunflower growing wild long before Johnny was born. As far as having dug the Grand Canyon by hand in a very short time, I believe overnight, does not do justice to the Grand Canyon. That all sounds a lot like braggadocio to me. I don't think that kind of bragging becomes a Kansan. Now, as far as stopping tornadoes and tying them in a knot and tossing them over his shoulder, that I can believe. I can just see it happen. He stands the 25 feet tall guy, a giant, in the wide open fields, with storm clouds gathering darker and darker, the wind tossing his wild hair. And then there is this funnel. He grabs it and twists it as hail beats his shoulder and his bare head. But he hangs on to the twister and grabs another one as it passes by. He's a great man doing what he can do for our state, Kansas. After the storm is over, he will straighten up the fallen wheat and set the fence back up. Like I said, he is a farmer. I'm sure he can milk a cow or two. A Kansas farmer standing on the corner of the city park. Apparently, just standing there is not enough, as there has been talk of raising money to improve the site. There's talk of a plaza there at the corner of 11th Street and Poyntz Avenue. When I came to Manhattan on April 1st, 1974, it was very soon that Johnny introduced himself to me. He and I got along quite well from the start. I've had a few questions, and at a meeting of landscape architecture students, where I was invited to speak, I discussed Johnny as I did a few other important tall figures standing in other places in our state. Madonna of the Plains in Council Grove comes to my mind. Anyway, back to Johnny. I talked about the setting of famous statues, and that so very often the setting does not fit. Now take Johnny. With all the other stories of the great things he did, to me all braggadocio, he is a wheat farmer first. That being so, I suggested to the students that we should understand what a statue is about. Having said that, I then developed a setting for Johnny, which fitted him, the farmer. I would take a small parcel of land in front of Johnny, and each year I would celebrate growing wheat. We are the wheat state. I would go through each step of preparation of the small parcel, making it ready for seeding. Then, in the fall, sow the seed by hand, in the old way. After all, Johnny is using a scythe. So doing it the old way, I would sow wheat by hand. Newer varieties are fine, but Turkey Red would be my choice. That is celebration. During the early summer, we could follow the growing process with all its ups and downs, like our wheat farmers experience. The chances of drought, hail, storms. Then there would be harvesting time. A small field, half an acre, a quarter of an acre, can be harvested by hand or small sickle bar mower, tied and placed in shocks. That growing process would honor our Johnny and keep us in touch with growing a wheat crop. Of course, it is true that once pavers are laid down, one can forget about it. But that's the whole point. That is not celebrating. Adding flowers, even sunflowers, doesn't do it. Johnny is about Kansas wheat.
Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with his weekly commentary on rural Kansas. And thanks for tuning in on this Wednesday. Please rejoin us here tomorrow, won't you? Meantime, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.